Hey there Halloweenies, it's Blackmetalwerewolf making a brand new October video for you guys. And this video we're going to be talking about one of my most favorite things in the entire world. The Simpsons. More specifically, the Simpsons Halloween Treehouse of Horror episodes. The Simpsons have been around for, I'm going to say close to 30 years, if not more. It's older than I am. Even if you don't like The Simpsons, chances are you know of it. All you have to do is say Homer Simpson and everyone knows what you're talking about. When I was a kid, the Halloween episodes were my absolute favorite. It was nice for them to kind of take a break, and instead of looking at like a fractured look at the American family kind of thing, they focused on parodies of horror movies, sci-fi movies, episodes of The Twilight Zone, and all that kind of fun stuff. So for this video, I'm going to be doing my top 10 Treehouse of Horror segments. Coming in at number 10 is Homer's Nightmare from Treehouse of Horror number 2. This is essentially a Simpsonized retelling of Frankenstein. Homer gets canned from the power plant after Mr. Burns finds him sleeping on the job. Homer ends up having to work in a graveyard digging graves, and Mr. Burns wants to create a perfect employee by putting a human brain inside of a robotic worker. Of course, Mr. Burns finds Homer's body, pops his brain out, and hilarity ensues. The thing that really sticks with me about this episode is the creepy atmosphere it manages to create. The graveyard scenes at night look fantastic, and the idea of a mad scientist scooping out someone's brain against their will and putting it in a robotic worker is pretty darn creepy. Another thing I loved about this was all the Wizard of Oz references. For example, when Mr. Burns scoops out Homer's brain, he starts humming "If I Only Had a Brain." And of course the scene where he puts Homer's brain on his head and yells, "Look at me, I'm Davy Crockett." It's just fucking hysterical. And that's why this episode earns the number 10 spot on my list. Number 9, the Ho-Mega Man. This is a Simpsonized version of the book I Am Legend, which got turned into the movie The Last Man on Earth starring Vincent Price, which then got turned into the movie The Omega Man starring Charlton Heston, which then got turned into the movie I Am Legend starring Will Smith. Of course, the Simpsons version is the best of all of them. Essentially what happens is Mayor Quimby makes a racial slur against the French, who then end up nuking Springfield. Homer was in a bomb shelter at the time, and it turns out he's the last man in Springfield. He then lives it up knowing he's the last person after he gets over, his whole family being killed. It turns out that some of the residents weren't annihilated, they got turned into mutants who wants to create a utopian society after they eat Homer's skin. Of course, this is a fantastic episode with hysterical references, lots of killing, lots of bloodshed, and of course all the fun things that happen when Homer thinks he's the last man on Earth, kicking the guy's head in the movie theater, punching Kirk Van Houten's skull. It all adds up to a scary, funny time. And that's why this one earns number 9 spot. Number 8, Bad Dream House. This is from the very first Treehouse of Horror episode, and it's a Simpsonized retelling of the Amityville Horror. Essentially, the Simpsons move into a big mansion that there's no way they could possibly afford, and it turns out it is haunted by a demonic ghost that ends up wanting them to all kill each other. The reason why I put this on here is because it's kind of lacking on the comedy, but it's actually very heavy in the horror. That scene where the ghost is telling everyone to kill themselves, "The butcher knife, Lisa, get the butcher knife," that's disturbing, and the family's actually about to slaughter each other until Marge kind of breaks them up. And of course, there are a few funny moments, like when they find the vortex, and then they throw garbage in, and a note comes back saying, "Quit throwing your fucking garbage in our dimension." So it does have some comedy, but for me, the best part of it is the horror. Of course, the episode comes to an end where the house decides to destroy itself when the Simpsons refuse to move. So that's pretty damn funny too. Number 7. Clown Without Pity. This is one of those episodes that kind of irritates me for the right reason. It's a fantastic episode, but the thing that bothers me the most is how for some reason everyone thinks it's a Simpsonized retelling of Child's Play with Chucky. But it's not. It's a Simpsonized retelling of the Twilight Zone episode, Living Doll, where the family gets a doll and it turns out it wants to kill the dad. Kind of like what happens in this episode. Essentially, if you haven't seen it, Homer forgets to get a present for Bart's birthday, and he ends up finding a cursed doll in a very Gremlins-esque shop. Of course, it turns out the crusty doll is evil and wants to kill Homer. The best thing about this episode is the comedy. It's stepped up to the next level. The scene where the crusty doll attacks Homer in the bathtub, the shop owner with the doll is also cursed. That entire segment fucking cracks me up every single time. So this episode might be a little light on the horror, but the comedy makes it so fantastic, and knowing that's based on a Twilight Zone episode, mwah! Number 6, Bart Simpson's Dracula. Of course, the Simpsons had to do a Dracula one eventually, and they knocked it out of the park. And in this Simpsonized tale, Mr. Burns is Dracula, and he invites the Simpsons over to eventually feast on them. He ends up getting Bart, who then attacks Lisa in their home, and the family realizes that Bart's a vampire, and they have to go kill the head vampire. Mr. Burns. I'm not going to give away the ending, even though this episode's like 20 years old and you should know the ending by now. But regardless, it is still a fantastic episode, great ending, and the horror and comedy are top notch in this one. The Three Stooges references, the Lost Boy references, everything comes together for just a perfect vampire story. Honestly, this episode of The Simpsons, this vampire episode, is better than most vampire movies I've seen, so that's gotta say something. Number 5, and boy are we getting into the good ones here. This one is Time and Punishment. This is a Simpsonized telling of the Ray Bradbury book, Sound of Thunder. Essentially, Homer destroys the family toaster, tries to rebuild it, accidentally makes a time machine, sends himself back in time, kills a mosquito, goes back. Turns out that Flanders has become the unquestioned ruler of the world. He ends up getting scared, keeps going back and forth between time periods, trying not to screw anything up in the past, but ultimately constantly doing it. This is a very funny episode with Homer coming back to seeing what he did and how the universe has changed. My favorite is when he accidentally erases donuts from the history book, but then donuts end up raining from the sky. Very funny. And of course the high point of this episode with James Earl Jones voicing Maggie. This is indeed a disturbing universe. I can't do his voice, but you know what I mean. Anyway, if you haven't seen this episode, definitely check it out. It's very fast-paced, funny, not really scary, but the sci-fi element is really in there. Number 4, you know I had to do this one, The Shining. Of course, this is a Simpsonized telling of The Shining. Mr. Burns owns the big Overlook Hotel, and then he invites the Simpsons to be the winter caretakers. He doesn't want a sloppy job, so he cuts off the TV and the beer supply, so they have no distractions. Homer ends up going crazy and then trying to murder his entire family with an axe. If you've never seen The Shining, this is actually a pretty good place to start, because I saw this episode long before I actually saw the movie, and it really does a pretty good job of telling it through a cartoon Simpsons point of view. Of course, this one is heavy on Groundskeeper Willie, which is good for me because he's one of my favorite characters. The scare factor is good, the references are through the roof, it's just a fantastic episode, so if you're a fan of Stephen King, if you're a fan of The Shining movie, if you like The Simpsons, this one is a must-see, and is most likely in everyone's top 10 list. Alright, we're down to the top 3, and at the number 3 spot we have Dial Z for Zombies. This is one of the ones I'm not really sure if it's based on a specific movie or if they're just doing a zombie episode for The Simpsons. Either way, it's still amazing. Essentially what happens is, Bart needs to do a book report and he ends up wandering into the occult section in the school library and finds a magic book. Lisa wants her pet cat, Snowball No. 1, resurrected, and Bart is happy to help. But it turns out he accidentally raises the entire human graveyard instead of the one dead cat. Of course, the zombies come to life, start eating everybody and turning them into zombies too. This is one of my favorites because of how violent it is, especially at the end when they're going through the school and Homer starts fucking shooting zombies left, right, and center, and you see Barney there eating an arm, just because why the hell not? He has the opportunity to. And of course the scene where he shoots Flanders before realizing he's a zombie. This one is really high on the horror and violence aspect, which makes it amazing. And of course, one of my favorite scenes is when Bart is performing the spell, and he has the Michael Jackson Thriller album cover as the hat. Very clever reference. Now, at the number 2 spot, we have Terror at 5.5 feet. This is obviously a Simpsonized version of the Twilight Zone episode, Terror at 20,000 feet. Essentially, Bart has a horrible nightmare that he's going to be killed that morning, and then he gets on the bus, he looks out the window, and there's a small gremlin climbing up the side of the bus, trying to undo one of the wheels. He ends up freaking out, no one believes him, and then it turns out that at the end, there was a gremlin on the side of the bus, and thanks to Bart, he saved all their lives, but they still think he was wrong for him to disturb the bus, so they ship him off to the booby hatch. This one, of course, is so fantastic for several reasons. The comedy is through the fucking roof, especially when Bart yells, "There's a gremlin on the side of the bus," and you see Mole Man driving a gremlin. Oh, excellent. The horror aspect is also amazing too, especially at the end where the gremlin is holding Ned's head. Like, you see the veins in his spinal column hanging out. For a TV show that is essentially aimed at kids to young adults, it's pretty fucking scary. I'm surprised the Fox censors let them get away with that. And of course, the number of references to the original Twilight Zone episode is like the icing on the cake. Of course, I'm a huge fan of the Twilight Zone, and anybody who is a fan of the Twilight Zone will pick up on that instantly and appreciate it for what it is. Now, before I get to the number one, I just want to give you a brief rundown of the runners-up. This was a really difficult list to make. I sat down and watched these episodes over and over and over again, and had to write down the pros, the cons, the scariness, the funny, all the stuff that made me compile this list. And unfortunately, I did have to cut some of the ones I wanted to put in here, because some of them were just plain better. I wanted to make this list longer, but I suppose a 40-minute video of me talking about The Simpsons, people might get bored for a while. Regardless, here are the runners-up. Alright, now that we've taken a look at all the losers, we can finally get down to number one, my top pick for Simpsons Treehouse of Horror segments, and that is Nightmare Cafeteria. This one landed the number one spot because of how fucking terrifying it is. It's really just the Simpson kids go to school and the teachers have developed a taste for human blood and then start farming the children, putting them under permanent detention. If I remember correctly, this is a Simpsonized version of Soylent Green, where the government starts harvesting humans and turning them into food. Essentially, it's not really the funniest episode, which is fine, but this one is really racked up on the terror because for me, this is actually one of my biggest fears, being eaten against my will. Though I suppose there are very few people who would want to do it, willingly, but there are a lot of freaks out there, so who the fuck knows. Either way, it does have some comedy, but for the most part, it's just a very scary episode, especially when it leads up to the climax of Bart, Lisa, and Milhouse being chased through the halls by Skinner and Lunch Lady Doris, hell-bent on fucking butchering and eating them. And that's why it has earned its place as number one Treehouse of Horror segment. So that's my top 10 list of the Simpsons Treehouse of Horror segments. Do you agree with my list? Do you disagree? Please tell me in the comments what ones you would put as the top 10. I really like my list, of course, but I would like to see your guys' take and why you chose the ones you chose. So that's it for today's video. If you like what you saw, don't forget to like and subscribe. Leave me a comment letting me know what you thought of today's video. Check out some of my past videos and share it with a few of your friends while you're at it. If you want to keep up with me on a more daily basis, you can follow me on Facebook and on Instagram. Those will be in the description. I also have a P.O. box, so if you'd like to write me a letter, that's in the description as well. Just so you guys know, my regular Black Metal Werewolf logo patches are officially sold out. I sold the last one out this morning. But I still have plenty of the Halloween patches. So if you'd like to get your very own Black Metal Werewolf Halloween patch, just click right over here. There's also a link in the description if you'd like to go through there. Overall, thank you very much for watching, guys. And stay spooky.